It may surprise you to know that I'm looking for the very first chapter of Hispanic or Latinx history in Milwaukee in the Enderis Park neighborhood. Nowhere near what's considered the heart of Latino Milwaukee. To tell you why, we'll kick off this conversation at a drag bar. Yep, you heard that right. But for now, let's just say that over the course of 3 episodes, we'll meet a historian, an organist, and a drag performer as we talk about the remarkable life of the first Latino to settle here, almost 130 years ago. So stay tuned. I'm Mariano Avila, and you're listening to the first Crónica in our inter-season series, Here at Speaking Of, a podcast by Milwaukee PBS. Now let's get to that drag bar and meet up with my co-hosts, Alexandria Mack and Scotty Myers. We are on 5th and National at Hamburger Mary's. The gentleman that I interviewed to ask who the first Hispanic person to settle here is, I asked him, what is the heart of the Hispanic community for you? And he said, 5th and National, no question. I talked to you, Scotty, and I was like, all right, what's on 5th and National? I see absolutely nothing that relates to Hispanic people here, so like...
I mean, it used to be a Mexican restaurant, La Perla, where you could come in and ride a chili pepper. But now it's a place called Hamburger Mary's, a drag queen performance center, a bar. And we went to their website and we saw that Thursday nights is Diva de la Noche, the Latinx drag show. And I mean, how perfect is that? Doesn't get better than that.
So do either of you have memories of coming here when it was La Perla, or have you been here before as in its current configuration?
I know I for sure went to La Perla, but I don't remember. I was a kid, just the same way where I remember La Fuente, but I don't remember. Botanas I have adult memories of, but the other restaurants definitely was a kid, so I could not enjoy the beauty of the margarita just yet.
Did you ride that little chili or big chili pepper? I don't know. What was it like?
I'm going to say no. I didn't even remember that was a thing, so I don't think I did.
Oh, yeah, I definitely did. It was a blast. I mean, it was kind of like, you know, you go to a department store back in the day, you put a quarter in the machine, it'd be that little horsey that kind of goes up and down. It was basically that, but it was fun. It was the chili pepper, exactly, like...
Mechanical produce rides aside, there's certainly a tradition of entertainment at 5th and National that Hamburger Mary's is carrying on, with its rose petal wallpaper and purple LEDs around its soda dispenser, its diva nights. And we will talk to one of their divas in this series, but first I want to introduce you to the man who kicked off the idea for this exploration in the first place.
Luis Arnoldo Sevilla Robel.
I mean, I just call him Don Arnoldo. He's an octogenarian from Mexico City whose father was part of that first wave of Latin American migrants to Milwaukee back in the 1920s. We know them affectionately as Los Primeros, the firsts. Don Arnoldo's dad moved here and then married a Polish-American woman. Then the whole family moved back to Mexico, where Don Arnoldo spent his childhood and a good part of his youth. This whole thing started when I researched how far back we could trace the Latinx community in Milwaukee, and I ran across a professor named Sergio Gonzalez at Marquette University who pointed me to Don Arnoldo, saying that the man has collected all there is to know about Rafael Baez, the first Latino to settle in Milwaukee. So naturally I sought out Don Arnoldo, and on a sunny summer day I met up with him here at Holy Cross, a lush park-style cemetery in Enderis Park, where he walks, regularly paying his respects to the Baez family, whose weathered headstone is nestled in a grove of oaks and cedars.
I came here to think, to walk, and I feel very comfortable being in the cemetery. For me, it's a relaxation, and come and with a purpose also visit my friends that I adopted myself, because I know they don't have no family. They say, well, you are my family now.
Don Arnoldo's story really does intertwine with the Baez family on a very personal level. But it starts with Rafael Baez, born in 1863 in Puebla, Mexico, where he became such a talented musician that when Milwaukee's C.D. Hess Opera Company toured in Mexico, they were so impressed by his talent as an organist that they brought him back with them. Once in Milwaukee, he married into an affluent German-American family and lived his days out here as a prominent member of the city's cultural elite. He and his wife Mary had 4 children. One died as an infant. The remaining 3 became veterans during both World Wars, but none gave them grandchildren. So Francis and Mary, the 2 youngest, lived together during their final years, and that's where the Baez family and Don Arnoldo became a single story. He wrote them letters and tried to interview them, but they rejected him at first.
No, I went back again. No, they don't want to talk to you. For me to interview them, because for me, they were so special for being the first Mexicans born in Milwaukee. But they don't want to know that. They didn't want it to be Mexicans. That was the first thing. And then bothered me more. They said because they were Mexican, they don't feel like Mexicans. That's what the nurse told me about it. They said, no, they are Americans and they are German. Wow. Okay. Nothing happened. It passed 1 year, and the second year there was a beautiful day. Probably would be March or April. I don't remember the date. It was a beautiful day, and they said, "No, I go now there." And I went over there, and the nurse came in. And they said, "Oh, how are you, Mr. Sevilla?" She knows me already. She likes me. And they say, "Oh, you know what? They are so happy today. They are very happy right now because the day and this and that." Wait for me. I want to talk to them about who you are. And they said, "Okay, what? Talk." I wait for it. I wait maybe 5 minutes or something like that outside. And then she come in. "Mr. Sevilla, they agree to meet you. And they invite you to come in. They want to meet you too." After 2 letters. And I entered and I saw them both.
It was the 1980s and both Francis and Mary were getting up there in years, over 80 years old, so Don Arnoldo, who himself was only in his 40s, began a relationship with the Baez siblings, regularly taking them on walks or driving them to the lake, and all the while interviewing them and telling them about his research on their remarkable father. But a few months later, Francis died. Mary started to decline, and altogether it seems that the relationship lasted only about 2 years before she passed too. But the bond was strong enough that Don Arnoldo recalls Mary holding his arm during her brother's burial, right here at Holy Cross. By 1986, they had both passed, leaving behind no remnant of the Baez family save the gravestone and the memories in Don Arnoldo's records. Now, surviving the family is some of the music of Rafael Baez, who was the first Latino professor at Marquette University. He also became a popular organist at churches and synagogues. Of those organs, only some of the pipes remain, and they are at Marquette University's Jesu, where he actually did play. Now, I did go and talk to their current organist and music director, Dean Roscoe, but that is for another episode, where we'll talk more in detail about Baez's musical career. Right now, I want us to go back to Hamburger Mary's and talk to Lexi and Scotty about Walker's Point, the neighborhood Don Arnoldo considers the historic heart of Latinx Milwaukee.
I was doing a little bit of research about this, and from what I understand, and Mariano or Lexi, I'm sure you can fill me in, because I'm probably getting the history a little bit wrong here, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the 1920s, immigration stopped for Europeans to come into America. This left labor shortages, and so capitalist-hungry business owners here in the city went to recruit laborers south of the border. They went to Mexico, and that's really what brought folks here. And when we talk about coming to Milwaukee, it wasn't so much they had a choice of where to live. This is where the factories were. This is where the cheapest housing was. And then also they were dealing with, for lack of a better word, a lack of acceptance from the community. And so really this became the center, and like you said, the heart of Milwaukee's Latinx community.
Well, and the other thing about the Latin communities around the Midwest, I would say, they tended to gravitate toward where Polish people settled before them. And that has a lot to do with religion. So Polish and Italian neighborhoods have, in many cities, become Latin neighborhoods because that's where all the churches were. The Catholic churches were set up first. And so if you're Catholic and from Mexico or wherever, coming into these cities where you don't know anybody, well, you go to church first. Got to do that every Sunday.
That makes so much sense because there are so many churches here in the South Side, St. Stanislaus, St. Anthony's, and that's fascinating. This is a really important story, I think, Mariano, just because Milwaukee doesn't have any national historic landmarks that honors any bit of history of Milwaukee's Latin community. There's literally no plaque. That doesn't really exist here. And so I think we are doing a really important thing here in honoring these stories, these narratives. What drew you to this story?
Being Mexican.
Also, let it be noted that I'm the only person who doesn't speak Spanish here at this table.
Hey, don't give me too much credit. I can get by. But Mariano, I'm curious in hearing this story and them being intergenerational stories. How does it feel for you, hearing of the first Latinx settler here, hearing of Drag Night and Divas de la Noche? Like, how do you feel learning of these things and these people?
It's a very good question. I don't know. I think, so the city of Milwaukee proper didn't start until like the mid-1800s. So really, Mexican people have been here pretty much as long as the city. And that to me is encouraging, because in the most segregated city in America, to say, yeah, we've had a place here pretty much from the beginning. It's encouraging. It's like, no, we have a place. I mean, I live in Tosa, but I like drive 25 minutes to get to the supermarkets in this part of town, because this is the only place where I can get the food that I love. So how do you feel about it? What's your relationship to this neighborhood?
Growing up, I lived on the northwest side of Milwaukee, and I still live on the northwest side of Milwaukee. So I didn't frequent the south side that often, besides coming to get amazing food, of course. And now in my adulthood, I do come down here pretty often. And it's interesting because gentrification, and I feel like in my adulthood I've seen that, in the sense of I've had a friend who lived in a loft down here, and the rent was like crazy prices, so we like helped move her in, and we also helped move her out because it was getting priced out. But also just like the types of businesses, it's like you can have a Mexican restaurant right here, but then you also have like a non-Mexican restaurant that's like kind of random, or like a juicing spot or something, you know, a random ice cream place. I actually had my first therapist on this part of town, so it's just like that variety of like seeing the old and the new.
You know, analysis of the 2020 census shows that the Latino population in Walker's Point fell by nearly half over the past 30 years. So in 1990, Latinos made up more than 2/3 of the population in Walker's Point neighborhood, where we are, and now they make up just 44% of the area residents. So I do think we're seeing that sort of push-pull of forces that are at play that means like we're seeing some displacement right now. And that really concerns me a little bit, a lot of it, I guess. There's so much magic in these places, and I think Milwaukeeans are naturally like nostalgic. Like we always look back and it was always better back then, and we know that's not true. And I'm just afraid like in 20 years, I'm going to see this neighborhood and be like, oh, this is nice. This is a great building. This is a great restaurant. This is a great whatever. But man, 20 years ago, it looked like this. It felt like this. And so that's one of the things like I'm thinking about right now.
On the flip side, it's worth thinking about the fact that Milwaukee's black and white populations are shrinking. People leave and pass away, and there just aren't enough babies to replace them. But the Latinx community, along with some of the Asian communities here in the city, are replenishing the population, adding children, workers, and students, the tax base of the future. And speaking of the future, we'll have to save the rest of this Crónica for the next 2 episodes. More on the bias story, our interview with Jesu organist Roscoe, and our interview with Marbella from Divas de la Noche at Hamburger Mary's. So stay tuned. This is our inter-season series, La Crónica, The Chronicles of Milwaukee, here on Speaking Of, a podcast by Milwaukee PBS. I'm your host for these first 3 episodes, Mariano Avila. My co-hosts are Scotty Myers and Alexandria Mack, and our sound engineer is Grant Martin. See you next week, and thanks for listening.